to the first episode of the story behind the gear, and this is an extension of Ask Earl Anything. I've started putting this as part of Ask Earl Anything, and I've been watching my Ask Earl Anything shows grow bigger and longer. So I think I'm going to do this as a segment because I have so much gear, and I get so many questions about gear I have and why I chose the gear, and what my thoughts were as to why I might want to use a piece of gear. So let's start today with a snare drum that's on this kit today. And today's piece of gear is the story behind my Noble and Cooley 5x14 snare drum. And this is my newest version of this drum, but let me explain to you the story behind the gear, why I have this drum, what this drum represents to me, where my first ideas came to have a Noble and Cooley snare drum. So let's take the story back, because that's really it. Why would I choose a Noble and Cooley? Now, a lot of guys would say, you know, you choose it because it's a solid shell snare drum, they're great snare drums. But when I really look at this, the reason I got to Noble and Cooley goes all the way back to when I was 19 years old and I was in college and I was teaching drum lessons at Blue Note Music in Point Pleasant, and Scott Hazen, my drum teacher from high school, was running the store, and he was looking for a solid shell Radio King drum, and he found it, and he bought this 7x14 solid shell Radio King drum, and it was marine pearl and had some lugs beat up, the strainer was beat up, but he still has the drum, by the way. But it was a one-ply shell, and it was a fascination with a one-ply shell. So he told me about it, and I thought, well, that's cool. It's a one-ply shell. It's a deep shell drum. I had just bought a Slingerland 6.5x14 chrome over wood snare drum to go with this kit, which I don't have that drum anymore. It was a terrible drum. Had a TDR throw-off on it, but I wanted a drum that looked metal but was wood because I had a Vistalite kit with a Vistalite snare drum, and the Vistalite snare drum was not happening. So anyhow, 19, impressionable. That's the snare drum I bought. I had that with this kit for a long time. I'm 19, I bought this kit. It's a 1979 Gretsch kit, of course. This is my kit from college. So I'm teaching lessons, and now I have this kit, and I've got this snare drum, and I've got a friend telling me you need a solid shell snare drum, and they're the hippest thing. So push forward to the late 1980s, and I'm in a band called Saved by Grace, and I meet this guy at a gig, at a concert in New York State. The band played up in New York State. I lived in New Jersey. The band was from Jersey. And I'm at the gig, and I'm playing that Slingerland snare drum. It doesn't sound really great. And the guy comes up to me and goes, you know, you really need to get a Noble Cooley. And I said, a Noble Cooley? And I'd heard of them because I'd seen the ads in Modern Drummer magazine. Phil Collins was starting to play them. A lot of studio guys had Noble Cooleys. They were expensive drums as far as I knew, and they were kind of custom, and didn't know anybody that had one, but this guy had one. He said, you really need to get a Noble Cooley. Can't remember his name. So it's stuck in the back of my head. Anyhow, at a Saved by Grace, I'm in a new band. I'm turning 30. It's my 30th birthday party, and my friend Scott Hazen comes to the party. And Scott comes to the party, and he brings a 7x14 Noble Cooley snare drum. No, he didn't give it to me, but he brought it with him, and he had it in his car, and we went out to his car, and he brought it in, and we were banging it, and the party was at my mom's house, but I didn't have drums there, so we were banging it out in the street, and he's telling me what a great drum this Noble Cooley is. And it was a deep shell 7x14 maple drum. I would eventually own that drum one day. So push ahead a couple more years. It's mid-90s, probably 1993 or 4. Trying to figure out exactly where I picked the drum up, but it was an early 90s 5x14 Noble Cooley snare drum. and my friend Pat O'Donnell from college bought the drum. And I had bought some electronics. In the 80s, you wanted electronics, you wanted sounds. Now, today I've got this sample pad, this SPD-SX, that's got all the sounds from the 80s and then all kinds of other stuff. Don't use it all that much, to be honest. But back in the 80s, all I wanted was a set of Simmons drums. So when I finally got the money to get a drum module and a couple pads, I bought a D4, a Lisa's D4, and a friend gave me some pads. And that was my electronic drums. And my friend Pat wanted some E-drums for some reason. He didn't so much want the pads, but he wanted the module, the D4 module. So he was not happy with the Noble Cooley he had. It was a black Noble Cooley 5x14 solid shell drum, classic, just like this drum, except it was like early 1990. Now this happens to be a 94 Noble Cooley. So this is not a new drum either, but I'll explain that to you too in a minute. So, long and the short of it, I traded a D4 and some other stuff I had. I wrote some rototoms. I had a 14-inch rototom. I gave it to him, and these pads, and he gave me that snare drum and some other percussion that I still have. And it was a great trade, and I was happy. And I had this black Noble Cooley, and I loved the drum. Just loved the drum. And I don't know why I traded it back to him. That was always the big question. There was a day we had a huge trade, and this is what I've done all my life. I've had friends I trade things back and forth with. Pat was one of them. And one day I traded him the Noble Cooley back for something else. I think I ended up with a Fibes drum kit. It was a 8x12, 9x13, 16x16 brown marble Fibes drum kit with a 22-inch kick drum. And I got that and something else, another snare drum. I think it was a Superphonic. I don't know. It was one of those crazy trades, but he got the drum back. I said, Pat, don't sell the drum. Just don't sell it. I'll get it back in a little bit. Give me some time. We'll find a way to trade it up again. Long and the short of it, 6 months later, Pat sold the drum, and he got some good money for it. These drums were not cheap. These were expensive drums, okay? And they run today somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000 to $1,200, depending on where you're buying them. And his drum was a great drum, and I loved it. And it had the sound that I loved for Noble Cooley. Now, what happened was, by the late 90s, when I didn't have that Noble Cooley, basically what happened was my friend Scott and I had a trade of another trade that we had going on right around that same time I gave him the Noble Cooley, and it was a trade for a set of Istanbul K hi-hats, 14-inch, and Scott still has those hi-hats today. They're really thin and brittle, and my friend Dave Jones didn't know what to do with them, and he had a son who was bashing rock drummer, by the way, a great drummer by the name of Zach Jones from New York. But Zach probably doesn't know this, and if Zach ever saw this, I don't know if he ever would, but I had this set of Istanbul Ks, and it was really jazzing type Ks, but they weren't good rock hi-hats. And one day, Scott and I were hanging out, and he had his 7x14. I still had the 5x14 Noble Cooley, and I had these hats. And Scott goes, I really want those hats. He said, what will you trade me for the hats? And I said, well, I'll take your 7-inch Noble Cooley. And we came to an agreement, and he gave me the 7-inch Noble Cooley. He took the hats. We agreed we would never sell either of those two pieces, that they would stay in the family, so to speak, because I had a deal with Dave Jones. I would never sell those hats. So they were in the family. They stayed in the family. That was the game. It was in the family. So now I had a 5x14 and a 7x14. And that's when I traded the 5x14 to Pat, back to Pat, for these Fibes drums. And anyhow, those Fibes drums ended up being traded to Scott. And Scott gave me the little Gretsch kit, the little maple Gretsch kit I have that you've seen in some of the videos. See, I had some friends that really traded stuff. It got bounced. This was the late 90s and we did that. So when I moved to Florida, I had a 7x14 Noble Cooley, didn't have a 5x14, and I was missing it dearly. So for years, I've been looking for a 5x14 Noble Cooley. One day, my friend Scott buys a Noble Cooley drum kit, which one day I would own that Noble Cooley drum kit too. And one of the cool things I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to actually put some video of some of these items and some pictures and things I have to show you the timeline and stuff. But that Noble Cooley kit was kind of a champagne sparkle color. And there was a 5x14 champagne sparkle snare drum that went with it that happened to be this snare drum. Now, this snare drum I've had since 2009, I believe, maybe 2008. But I think it was 2009 I got this drum from Scott. And the way the story went was this. Scott and I would trade all kinds of stuff. And we traded drums and snare drums and years of trading back and forth of stuff. So one day Scott wanted his 7x14 Noble Cooley back. So he traded me a 6.5x14 bronze hand-hammered snare drum, like the Bill Stewart snare drum, Superphonic. And I had that drum. And I used the 7x14 on my wife's album. I used that 6.5x14 phosphorus bronze Ludwig Superphonic snare drum. And Scott got his 7x14 back. And I was so unhappy. Now I had no Noble Cooleys. Now I had this Superphonic, this 6.5x14 Superphonic. But I didn't have a Noble Cooley anymore. I lost it. It was gone. So no Noble Cooleys. So I kept complaining to Scott, and then one day he bought a 4 7/8 by 14 alloy classic Noble Cooley, the metal aluminum drum. He bought that, really dirt cheap, and he traded me that for a Roger snare drum and something else and some cymbals. And so I had the 5-inch. This was like mid 2000s. I had a 5-inch or almost a 5x14, almost 5x14 Noble Cooley alloy classic. But it didn't cut it for me. I wasn't happy. Then one day Scott got his hands on I think it's 3 7/8 by 14 Piccolo Noble Cooley. He got that drum, and we traded something else, and I got that drum for a while. I think I traded back the alloy classic, to be honest. And I wasn't happy with that drum. And he kept bringing that drum kit down. He brought that snare drum. I said, bring that 5x14 Noble Cooley with you one of these days. So the next time he came down, I traded back that other Piccolo Noble Cooley to him, and I somehow absconced this 5x14 solid shell Noble Cooley, but it wasn't this color. It was that sparkly champagne sparkle color. So, once I got that drum back with the champagne sparkle color, it stayed. And since 2009, I have documented 2009 is probably around the time I got that drum. I have kept that drum. And I used it. And then one day in 2013, I think, it had to be 2013 or middle of 2014, we traded for the little Gretsch kit, the little maple Gretsch kit again, and I traded for his Noble Cooley kit. And I got a hold of the 9x13, 16x16, 18x22 Noble Cooley kit that matched the snare drum, and I had the whole kit and the universal line, and I had all the Noble Cooley. I had a Noble Cooley kit, and I had a Noble Cooley snare drum, and it was great. And I did Danielle McManus's album, the live album, in 2014 with that kit, the Noble Cooley kit. And I did not use the snare drum. I used one of my DMRs. I think I used the cast aluminum, which was the sound the producer wanted. So anyhow, long and short of this long story is one day we traded back. This was probably 2017-ish. Yeah, it was 2017, because that's the year I started doing YouTubes. And that April when I started doing YouTubes, I got laid off from the company I was at, and I got bought out, and I was on my extended, my time of trying to find myself, I'll call it, in 2017, what happened was I got the little Gretsch kit back, and he got the Noble Cooley kit, but he didn't get the 5x14 snare drum. The 5x14 stayed with me. Problem was that color didn't match anything I had, or wasn't even close to anything I had. And it really bothered me for a long time. The other thing with that Noble Cooley kit was the guy that bought the kit, and the story with the kit goes, he had the snare drum and the bass drum repainted to match those toms that he bought. So he bought the toms separately, had a bass drum, had this Noble Cooley snare drum, which was black, by the way. This was a black snare drum at one time. And he had it repainted by somebody. And the paint job was terrible, and it was actually flaking off. So I was really getting annoyed with it. So fast forward to 2020. In January of this year, I was just kind of feeling like I needed to do something with my life. This was before COVID hit and all that stuff. And, you know, I went through the whole thing with my son, and my wife said, you know, why don't you do something for yourself? And I said, well, would you mind if I got this snare drum, this Noble Cooley painted? And she looked at me and she said, no, if you want to get it painted, go ahead. So I called Noble Cooley up, and I thought I was going to have it painted black, to be honest. I called Noble Cooley up on the phone, and I got one of the guys in the shop, I forget his name, this was a few months back now, almost a year ago. And we talked. And I said, I had this snare drum. I gave him the serial number. He said, yeah, that was originally a black drum. Yeah, I said, I don't know how the guy got it painted, but the paint's chipping. I said, can you refinish it? And he said, yeah. And I basically boxed it up and sent it back to him. And he sent me back, essentially, a new drum. He was supposed to clean up all the lugs he did clean up the rims. These are the original Noble Cooley rims that came with it. But he stripped the drum and he stained it this cherry wood color that he had. They didn't have a walnut match. They had a couple other cool colors though. It might have been kind of cool to go with the birch walnut look, you know, deep birch wood. But this is the one I chose. It kind of matches the kit. It's the same drum I've had for the last, you know, 10, 11, 12 years, whatever it is now. And they put the Noble Cooley snares on it. They put a new butt and a new throw. It looks, either they did that or they cleaned it up. I don't know. But if they cleaned it up, they did a lot of work. This came brand new. This kit looked like a brand new kit, new snare drum when I pulled it out of the box. And I actually have a video of that. I'll take some of the clip and put it behind me talking right now. And this drum is just an amazing drum. And I will never get rid of this drum. This drum will go to one of my grandkids. Now, so what's the fascination with the Noble Cooley? Well, this drum has got a tuning range that's amazing. It can be tuned down low, and it can be tuned up high as a piccolo. And it's got a lot of crack to it. And Noble Cooley's back in the 80s only used die cast. There were no triple flange hoops on their solid shell snare drums. I've come to find out that the reason why they're not putting die cast hoops on their snare drums anymore has to do with the fact that the company that was making them for them went out of business. So at this point in time, it's hard to get Noble Cooleys with the die cast hoops, especially the original die cast hoops, which had this little flat edge to it. So there was like a little flat spot. So this is really an original Noble Cooley die cast hoop snare drum. And anyhow, love the drum, love the sound of it. It's been on a lot of videos. It gets pulled out a lot. You see it a lot. When I go to a 5x14, I either go to the Black Beauty or I go to this drum. Those are my two most common drums. I have an Acrolite I use occasionally. I have a 5x14 Gretsch chrome over brass that my son-in-law gave me that was all beat up and I fixed up. And it sounds great. Nice drum, but when I go to a 5x14, it's either the Black Beauty or this, usually, for the most part. Those are the drums of choice for it, and it's about the crack. So that's the story behind the gear, and that was my journey. And it all started with Scott Hazen showing me a solid shell snare drum, a Radio King, and saying, you really need to get one of these. And it kept coming back to me, you need to really get one of these. Now, I love solid shell snare drums so much that when I was with DMR Custom Drums, they made me a couple snare drums. One of those snare drums is a solid shell walnut drum. So I've got a 7x14 solid shell walnut drum that has a look of a Radio King. I wanted it to look like a Radio King more than anything else, to have that Radio King kind of look with the lugs and everything else. And now it really has the Radio King sound because I took the die casts off and I put a straight edge on it, and it really has a really Radio King-y kind of sound out to it. But solid shell snare drums, definitely something you want to look at. If you want to look at great solid shell snare drums, Noble and Cooley is one of the greatest solid shell snare drum companies in the country. I know Johnny Craviotto made a lot of solid shell snare drums, and a lot of guys love his drum, and I would love to have a Craviotto. I don't have one. But when I talk solid shell snare drums, Noble Cooley is top of the line to me. So, anyhow, thanks for watching. That's the story behind the gear. See you next time. Bye. Oh, one more thing. If you see a piece of gear in my studio that I use, like that you like and you like the sound of it, and you want to know what the story is, don't hesitate to write me in the comments section of any of my videos and say, hey, could you tell me a story about how you picked this 16-inch thin crash? Where does that come from, this 2002? If you want to know about it, ask me, and I'll make it another segment for, the story behind the gear. Thanks again. Bye.